Fiction enters town. Fiction as civic disturbance, temporal activation, and speculative social form. Introduction. This paper examines the development of an ongoing fiction film project situated in my hometown, Almadén, southern Spain, a former mercury mining town marked by economic decline, depopulation, and political exhaustion following the closure of its mine in 2003. Emerging from my long-term artistic and ethnographic engagement with the town, the project approaches fiction not primarily as representation, but as situated intervention embedded within everyday life. Rather than constructing a fictional world separate from reality, the project proposes to insert a speculative situation directly into lived social space. Professional actors undertake performative actions in the streets, squares, and landscapes. Cinematic strategies of mise-en-scène partially transform the town into a film set while ordinary life continues around them. And genres, symbols, and institutional forms are mobilized not simply as aesthetic devices, but as frameworks for social interaction. The central question is therefore not whether fiction can accurately represent reality, but what happens when fiction begins operating inside it. This shift emerged from two earlier films I made in Almadén, Pablo's Winter, 2012, which revisited the memory of a 1984 miners' locking strike in Almadén, and 11 Underground, 2025, which restaged that strike with younger generations. During the production of 11 Underground, reenactment unexpectedly generated public discussion, civic encounters, and forms of political mobilization. At the same time, local authorities dismissed the process as only fiction. This paradox became the departure point for the present project. If fictional actions can reactivate memory, reorganize collective perception, and generate social effects, then fiction cannot be understood solely as representation. It must also be understood as a social operation. The project enters into dialogue with contemporary discussions of fiction as a method for acting within reality rather than escaping from it. This resonates with 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗁's understanding that politics and art both operate through the construction of fictions, understood not as falsehoods, but as material rearrangements of signs and images, relationships between what is seen and what is said, between what is done and what can be done. Within this framework, film becomes political not because it transmits ideological messages directly, but because it reorganizes the perceptual conditions through which reality itself becomes intelligible. Fiction, in this sense, is not opposed to reality. It participates in organizing how reality becomes perceptible. This project, therefore, does not seek to convince anyone that fictional events are literally real. Actors remain visibly actors. Staging remains visible. The interventions operate through friction, the unstable coexistence of fiction and reality within shared public space. What interests the project is precisely this encounter, where cinematic construction enter lived environments whose responses cannot be fully controlled. Reactivating, reenactment beyond nostalgia. A central operation of the project involves what might be called temporal actualization, the transformation of archival memory into present tense experience. Several actions draw upon historical practices associated with 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗁, a nearby agricultural landscape historically linked to communal agricultural rights assigned to miners through an annual lottery. Although many residents maintain strong emotional ties to the territory, access to 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗁 is now heavily restricted. Public paths have been chained off, entry is controlled by the mining company, and large areas remain inaccessible and unused. Former miners recall how hundreds of workers gathered outside the town hall while numbers were drowned inside. A voceador, a speaker, stepped onto the balcony and publicly announced the names of miners who had obtained access to plots known as suertes, luck. These events combined bureaucracy, ritual, and collective anticipation. They were administrative procedures, but also public performances through which relationships between labor, territory, and belonging became visible. Rather than documenting these memories, the project asks what happened when such rituals return performatively into the present. Imagine the contemporary square, traffic passing, cafes open, everyday life unfolding. Suddenly, a figure dressed in another historical period appears on the balcony and begins announcing the names of hundreds of miners long deceased. The action becomes simultaneously absurd, melancholic, theatrical, durational, and politically charged. The aim is not historical reconstruction. It is to create a temporal disturbance through which the past ceases to appear finished. A related action involves organizing a contemporary symbolic lottery through which residents receive fictional suertes. Participants might be given carefully designed permits inspired by historical documents. These permits would not grant actual access to the land. Their function is symbolic rather than legal, yet precisely within that gap between recognition and impossibility emerges the central question: what does it mean to receive a right that cannot be exercised? These actions attempt to materialize alternative relationships between territory, participation, and belonging without claiming to restore historical forms literally. What returns is not authenticity, but possibility. This approach resonates with Walter Benjamin's conception of history. In his thesis on the philosophy of history, Benjamin rejects the idea of history as linear progress and instead proposes moments in which forgotten pasts become suddenly perceptible within the present. To articulate the past historically, Benjamin writes, does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The project similarly treats history not as a closed archive, but as an unfinished material capable of re-entering contemporary life. Bertolt Brecht's notion of estrangement is equally relevant. In A Short Organon for the Theatre, Brecht defines estrangement as a representation that alienates and allows us to recognize its subject, but at the same time makes it seem unfamiliar. The objective was not immersion, but interruption, to reveal that social structures appearing natural or inevitable are in fact historical constructions. Rather than whether the past can return, the question is whether its unrealized or abandoned possibilities still remain thinkable. Intensifying fictional institutions and social imagination. A second operation involves what might be described as an intensification of the real. Rather than inventing entirely fictional worlds, the project amplifies existing tensions already present within the social fabric of Almadén. Through slight displacements, familiar realities become more visible, affectively charged, and publicly discussable. One proposal involves creating a fictional institution concerned with the future management of Castellceras. This institution might issue permits, organize consultations, hold symbolic elections, and conduct public assemblies. All of these activities would be openly fictional, yet performed within bureaucratic seriousness. Again, the question is not to produce make-believe, but perhaps question why these fictional structures might sometimes appear more participatory, visible, or imaginative than existing institutions. Importantly, the project does not seek parody. The institution is conceived less as a satire than as a speculative laboratory through which alternative forms of participation can be temporarily rehearsed. This direction emerged from recurring conversations with residents. Again and again, discussions returned to feelings of political paralysis, frustration, and territorial disconnection. Castellceras appeared repeatedly as a landscape that remained emotionally and physically close, yet socially and politically inaccessible. Within this context, fiction gradually shifted from narrative device to framework for social action. The same logic informed a speculative scene involving social media discourse. In a former public gathering space, loudspeakers broadcast fragments of online hostility for several hours. Insults, hate speech, conspiracies, inflammatory slogans, and polarized rhetoric. Residents sit listening as if attending a cultural event. This scene is excessive, but only slightly. What is normally dispersed through personal devices becomes public, collective, and embodied. The objective is not satire but exposure. By relocating digital communications into physical space, the project reveals dynamics already shaping social life while remaining largely invisible. Fiction intensifies that reality until it becomes perceptible. In this sense, fiction operates as a mechanism of social estrangement. It renders social structures visible by pushing them slightly beyond their ordinary threshold of perception. Performing territory, Western mythology and landscape. A third operation concerns landscape and cinematic genre. The landscapes surrounding Castellceras possess strong visual affinities with Western imagery. Dust roads, horses, ruins, abandoned infrastructures, contested land, and vast territorial space. Yet the project mobilized the Western not as nostalgic quotation, but as a critical and performative framework. Historically, the Western has been closely associated with frontier expansion, masculine conquest, territorial occupation, and extractive economies. The project attempts to invert these associations through alternative bodies and relationships to land. One speculative strand imagines a group of older local women, together with some actresses, traversing Castellceras on horseback, searching for traces of suertes historically associated with their families. Masculine conquest becomes feminine territorial memory. Frontier expansion becomes restricted access. Heroic occupation becomes uncertain collective search. The Western functions less as a genre for representation than as a framework for action. This methodological shift is crucial. Horses, journeys, encampments, waiting, searching, and territorial crossing are not simply images to be filmed. They become actions to be lived through and carried out within real environments. In this sense, the project shares affinities with Alan Kaprov's proposition that the line between art and life should be kept as fluid and perhaps indistinct as possible. The Western becomes a kind of performative score, a set of gestures, expectations, and spatial relations capable of organizing collective action. Importantly, the riders are not cowboys conquering territory, but women attempting to reconnect with landscapes from which they remain partially excluded. The genre is displaced into a radically different historical and social context. The journey itself might unfold over several days. Participants ride, walk, camp, wait, become tired, lose direction, encounter obstacles, and negotiate access. The Western ceases to function primarily as image and instead becomes lived experience. Landscape, consequently, becomes more than setting. It becomes archive, memory space, contested territory, and political material. This becomes especially significant given the possibility that access to castle ceras might remain restricted during production. Rather than treating this as a logistical obstacle, the project would incorporate it into its methodology. If the camera cannot fully enter the territory, the landscape might instead be constructed through distant observations, oral testimonies, archival photographs, maps, and speculative reconstruction. What cannot be fully accessed becomes imagined, narrated, and performed. Risk, failure, and the speculative. Because fiction enters lived civic space, the project inevitably encounters ethical and political risks. What does it mean for actors to articulate frustration rooted in real communities? At what point does intervention become own projection? How can fiction operate publicly without claiming to speak on behalf of others? The project does not attempt to resolve these tensions in advance. Rather, it treats them as constitutive conditions of the work. Claire Bishop's writing on participatory art becomes particularly useful here, especially her critique of approaches that equate participation with automatically positive forms of social inclusion. In Artificial Health, Bishop argues against what she calls the ethical turn in socially engaged art, where artistic practices are often evaluated primarily according to consensual or ameliorative social outcomes rather than aesthetics and political complexity. Instead, Bishop suggests that discomfort and uneasiness might constitute productive dimensions of participatory practice rather than signs of failure. As Bishop writes, participatory works might generate unease, discomfort, or frustration along with fear, contradiction, exhilaration, and absurdity, and can be crucial to any work's artistical impact. Rather than treating such reactions as ethical failure, the project understands them as constitutive aspects of operating within lived civic space. The project cannot determine its own outcomes. Participation might remain minimal. Fictional institutions might fail to resonate. Public interventions might appear naive or absurd. The work might simply fail. Yet, this possibility distinguishes speculative fiction from propaganda. The project does not seek to simulate successful political transformation. Instead, it inhabits the uncertain space between imagination and social reality. Conclusion. This project approaches cinema less as a medium for representing the world than as a framework for organizing encounters within it. Reenactment, fictional institutions, and genre become operational tools capable of activating historical memory, reorganizing social perception, and opening temporary spaces for civic imagination. The project does not propose solutions to the political and economic challenges facing Almadén, nor does it seek to restore abandoned communal forms. Instead, it asks why certain possibilities have become difficult to imagine and whether fiction might help render them perceptible again. More broadly, the project explores what forms of speculation remain possible within context marked by post-industrial decline and political exhaustion. Rather than projecting distant futures, it turns towards slight displacements within the present itself. If it advances a political proposition, it lies perhaps here, that social arrangements are historically produced, symbolically mediated, and therefore never entirely fixed. Fiction enters the town not to replace reality, but to reveal that reality itself remains unfinished.